For those who just want a quick summary, I give it about a 6.5 out of 10, but that number is subject to change. I thought it was fine in a lot of ways, and objectively pretty disappointing in others. As someone who likes Pillars, most of the enjoyment for me was just being able to experience the world of Eora in first person, and to get new content in the universe. So overall, I enjoyed it, but I don't know if I can actually recommend it to everyone. People definitely had extremely high expectations for this game, and I believe that was likely the game's biggest downfall. If you're thinking about playing this game, I'd say wait until it goes on sale. $70 is simply asking way too much money in my opinion, so just get it on Game Pass instead. And to the devs' credit, I don't think they intended to release an underwhelming experience for people. That's just unfortunately what happened for many fans. And that's my basic review. Now, for those of you who want something more in-depth, let's talk about Avowed. Timestamps will be included if you have a specific point you want to hear my opinion on. Avowed, for those who don't know, is the third installment in the Pillars of Eternity universe, which took the traditionally isometric real-time with pausing fantasy series into first person for the first time. Avowed was met with a lot of criticism upon its release, and honestly, most of it is completely valid from what I've heard. I say this as someone who ultimately enjoyed the game and will play it again, but I can fully understand its problems, and I'd like to talk about where the game's flaws come from, and where it succeeds, since there's just a lot of negativity about this game for some reason. And also, if you like this game, don't let anybody try to ruin your fun, okay? Just like what you like. My opinion doesn't matter, and neither does anyone else's. But if we just consume everything we're presented without pointing out the flaws, then companies will give us the bare minimum, which we obviously don't want. So having completed my first playthrough and having begun another one already, I feel uniquely equipped to talk about Avowed since I am also a big fan of Pillars, and of the Elder Scrolls, which is the series that Avowed is being compared to right now. Namely, I've seen a lot of people comparing it to the Elder Scrolls 4 and 5, which are some of my most played games on this planet. I do think that if this was your first entry into the Pillars universe, you're more likely to dislike the game, and if you've played Pillars already, you're more likely to have generally enjoyed it. But again, that's just a generalization. I'm going to start out by just talking about the structure, atmosphere, gameplay, art, and world building, and then eventually we'll jump into a section on the story where we'll cover major plot spoilers. I'll also have a spoiler warning for you ahead. I will be assuming that you at least understand the premise of Avowed going forward. And with that said, let's talk about what this game is trying to accomplish. Now, this is not your typical RPG where you get to create a blank slate character who just spawned into this world. You play as the official envoy for the Adeiran Empire in Avowed, taking on a mission to investigate the Dream Scourge in the Living Lands from the Emperor himself. Now, you can customize how your envoy feels about the Empire and pick different reasons for why you're employed by the Emperor, but at the end of the day, Avowed chooses your entire background for you. I've seen this game compared to Oblivion and Skyrim a lot, but I find it interesting how this setup is very similar to the agents from The Elder Scrolls II, Daggerfall. In Daggerfall, the agent is employed by and purported to be a friend of Emperor Uriel Septim VII, sent to Daggerfall by the man himself to jumpstart the main quest.
Over a year ago, King Lysandus of Daggerfall died honorably on the field of battle. He was as loyal a subject, ally, and friend as you are. I ask this as your emperor and your friend.
So what's the big difference here? Why are people mad at Avowed for doing this, but no one ever complains about The Elder Scrolls 2? Well, for starters, Daggerfall came out in prehistoric times, so most people haven't played it. It's just not that culturally relevant, and yeah, people don't really care. But secondly, Daggerfall gives you full autonomy over your character's appearance, and Avowed does not. Avowed forces the player to play as a godlike, and your character's base race must be either folk or elf, seeing as those are the dominant races in Adir. And you can't be a moon godlike, or a death godlike, or an endings godlike, or... well, you get the point. No, your godly patron is actually completely unknown to you, and it's a large part of the story. This makes the Adeiran Envoy less of a player insert character and more of an integrated character in the world of Eora that you just so happen to be able to control. They probably should have just gone ahead and made a pre-made character like Geralt from the Witcher series or something like that. They could have even pulled a Larian and made you sort of like an origin character in one of their games, but I digress. So yeah, the Envoy is very much a pre-made character in a lot of ways, and conceptually, I actually do find them really interesting. It's just that the Adiran Envoy feels like they'd be a cool character or companion that the Watcher of Cad Nua might meet at some point in their adventures, rather than someone who should be the protagonist of their own role-playing game, at least with how they were integrated. Speaking of the Watcher of Cad Nua, let's talk about how the protagonist was established in Pillars 1 and how it differs from Avowed. Minor spoiler warning for the tutorial of Pillars of Eternity. In Pillars 1, your character is a colonist that is trying to get a home in the Deerwood. You can pick a unique nation, class, race, and vocation that further define your colonist, but the point remains that you are traveling to the Deerwood for some reason or another. At the end of the tutorial dungeon in Pillars, your soul awakens, and you become aware of who you were in a past life, which does somewhat define your character going forward, as you must resolve the awakening or risk going mad with the memories of another lifetime. As the story goes on, you get to further clarify who you were in this past life and your relationships with people in your past life, but the general idea of the person from this previous timeline is pre-established. So both Pillars and Avowed do kind of have similar ideas going on with the characters being pre-established in a sense, but what's wrong in the execution of this idea in Avowed? Well, like I said, in Pillars you're a colonist, but that's pretty insignificant to be honest. It's your soul that's pre-established, which is pretty intangible, and it only comes up when you're doing the main storyline. And Pillars 2 has a pre-established character as well, but since it's a direct sequel to Pillars 1, the pre-established character is actually just your old character from Pillars 1, but you can totally redesign them if you'd like to. In Avowed, it's your entire character, from their race to their background to their very reason for being in the Living Lands, that's pre-established. Almost every character that you meet knows who you are due to either your godlike features or your reputation, so it takes a lot of autonomy away from the players in their perception of their own character. And people like to create their own PCs in RPGs. Especially in Pillars, which has some of the most unique fantasy races I've ever seen, it is a real shame that Avowed only gives you access to the most basic ones as your Envoy's template, even if it does make sense in the context of the game. If I were to play devil's advocate though, in defense of Avowed, it doesn't really feel like it's trying to be a Morrowind or a Baldur's Gate 3 that will let the player have basically unlimited choice. It's by nature a more railroaded experience that's trying to tell a very specific story. And games do this all the time without getting backlash for it. I just played through Indiana Jones, for example, which is a zone-based action-adventure game, and it's fairly railroaded in the story it's trying to tell. But people expected that from an Indiana Jones game. Obviously, you're going to play as Indiana Jones in the Indiana Jones game. But in Avowed, people were expecting to be anyone they wanted, and were instead forced to play Indiana Jones, as it were. So I think the developers mismarketed this game and did it a disservice by making people think that it was going to be some big open-world adventure where the player could do whatever they wanted. That's not to say that Avowed doesn't have its problems, and I think some of the blame does lie on players with their expectations set too high, but as soon as I started looking at Avowed from this kind of Indiana Jones perspective, it made me appreciate it a little bit more because it truly is not trying to be an open world game.
What is the biggest misconception out there about Avowed?
I've still heard people say that Avowed is fully open world. It is open zone.
Avowed is in fact distinctly open zone, not open world, which is how Pillars was constructed alongside the Outer Worlds as well. Avowed has specific stories it wants to tell, so it made you a specific character to tell those stories. It was just a different experience from what I was used to, but I can't say that I fully hated playing as the Envoy. The real issue for me with playing as this character comes from the dialogue of all places, which is usually a strong suit for Obsidian. However, it actually feels a lot like Fallout 4, unfortunately, where most of the time you only have about 4 dialogue options to choose from, whereas in Pillars, you typically had much more varied ways to respond to different situations, or at the very least, you had many different things that you could ask or talk to characters about. part of this definitely comes from all the characters in-game being fully voice acted, because with more dialogue options for the player to choose from, the more dialogue responses Obsidian has to record as well. For example, Pillars 1 and 2 don't have full voice acting, so they're able to have more varied responses, I feel. But just in general, the dialogue left me wanting a bit more. There's really no speech skill in the game, since Pillars actually doesn't have a speech-related attribute, so instead it has always relied on base skill checks. For instance, a character with high might may be able to intimidate easier, or a character with high perception may be able to uncover secrets before they're revealed. But often in Avowed, it felt like a lot of these options were just there for flavor. And that's not to say that having a dedicated speech skill means that there was no decision-making in the game. In fact, there were critical decisions that needed to be made at the end of every zone and during most quests. You just had to pay attention to the dialogue a little bit more closely, rather than just picking the option that had the persuade tag on it. Furthermore, the dialogue options in the game are definitely trying to lead you in a specific direction story-wise, or at least I felt that way, which sometimes felt a bit weird given your position as the Adiran Envoy. I liked what Crusader King 8277 on my YouTube community post had to say about this. The story doesn't feel immersive or engaging when I have dialogue options that are saying yikes while a companion expresses colonialism, something your character is sent to help, even if indirectly, support by the Emperor himself. Then there's dated references to old memes that have been hardly relevant for a while now. Call a priest, but not for me. That it just actively pulled me away from taking anything seriously. Overall, I agree with this take, although I was able to take things seriously. The interactions with the NPCs, though, just seemed slightly hollow. And hollow, I think, is a good way to talk about the NPCs in general. Most of the NPCs in Avowed are just uninteresting, I hate to say. Many of them just stand around most of the time as well. I saw someone describe them as furniture a couple of days ago, and I completely agree. Their animations weren't great either, unfortunately, and sometimes the facial syncing hit a sort of uncanny valley feeling. And this right here is a real nitpick, but I really didn't like that the Delimgons had pupils. It just looked weird. A Delimgon is basically the Aoran version of a Spriggan. Like, imagine if the Elder Scrolls Spriggans had pupils. It would look odd. All previous interpretations of Delimgon didn't have pupils either, so it just baffles me that they'd give them an objectively weirder and uglier design, but whatever, it's not like I lose sleep over this or anything. Furthermore, Avowed has quest markers that show up on the map when an NPC is offering one, and this does take the exploration out of talking to NPCs. Pretty soon into the game, I stopped talking to anyone who didn't have a quest marker since it was just filler content in my eyes. Another weird thing I noticed is that a lot of the NPCs actually look extremely similar, so much so that there are several different times throughout the game where you meet siblings or twins, and I have a sneaking suspicion, and this is just a conspiracy theory, that this is because they realized that their character creator was just lacking at a certain point. But again, I don't know this for sure. Now, as a Pillars fan, I thought many of the quests and ideas that these NPCs had were cool to see. Like, one of the quests early on has to deal with soul twins, that is, beings whose soul is split between two creatures. There was a quest I played where a soldier was selling out her comrades in support of Adir because she thought it was best for the future of the living lands. I played a quest where I had to negotiate a deal between a Delimgon and a local band of dwarves because they needed the water from the natural spring that the Delimgon protected. There was a small quest where a woman wanted me to take her food supplies to honor a burial site, and I was able to either honor her wishes or take the food to a city official to see it put to use for the starving population. Good, interesting ideas in these quests, but half of the time the NPCs themselves just felt like they were never in any real kind of danger, or honestly, that they were never really there at all. Speaking of, there's very few consequences that involve the NPCs. For instance, you can't harm friendly characters in any way. They don't react when weapons are fired, and most of them don't even really have a walk schedule or a day-night cycle. They just basically stand around. And this is extremely odd. I feel like Obsidian, again, mismarketed this game in this respect. Like, their last real open-world project, the Outer Worlds, allowed you to kill basically whoever you wanted to. In that game, if they wanted an NPC to be protected, they'd have them stand behind a layer of bulletproof glass. Hell, even in Skyrim, you can at the very least attack every character, even if you can't kill them. And I get it, the Adiran Envoy probably wouldn't want to kill civilians canonically, but then why allow me to create my own character in the first place? This is why I called the NPCs furniture earlier. They're basically just set pieces that you can get quests from and have small talk with, but other than that, they're not really alive. It also really takes it out of the game when you walk up to an NPC and slash your sword at them or fire a gun and they just don't even react. It really makes me appreciate the little things the Skyrim guards say when you walk past them just even more. Being acknowledged by NPCs in the world is nice, so I do wish that Avowed reacted more to me. There's also not a crime system in Avowed, so you can't steal anything technically, but you can just barge around people's homes and wantonly take stuff. These objects placed in homes throughout the game makes it feel like there may have been a stealing system at one point or another, and it may have been likely scrapped, because it does just feel a little weird to blatantly be taking personal objects from NPCs and them not having a real issue with it. And it kind of makes sense that they wouldn't integrate a crime system, since again, you're the Adiran Envoy, but it still feels unreactive. Again, the Outer Worlds had a crime system. I don't understand why Obsidian would take that feature out. And even compared to Pillars of Eternity, you can steal and kill NPCs if you're like a psycho. It'll just aggro everyone in the whole town against you and give you a major negative reputation in whatever city/faction you've grieved. Speaking of, Avowed does not have a reputation system, which is one of the coolest features in Pillars 1 and 2. Basically, in those games, depending on which dialogue options you choose throughout a playthrough, you could build up a reputation in certain adjectives that described your watcher. These were things like benevolent, cruel, clever, passionate, honest, etc. Eventually, when you hit certain thresholds in a reputation, people in the world would react differently to you upon your approach. Furthermore, they had faction reputations too, which Obsidian has had in nearly every game of theirs I've played, like New Vegas and the Outer Worlds. These reputations were a mix of positive and negative interactions you could have with organizations and could result in interesting mixed feelings with the proper ratio of positive to negative. I cannot understand why they removed these reputations, as they added so much flavor to the world. So yes, I totally get what everyone is saying. Avowed does feel very hollow and empty with the NPCs specifically, and in most of the world, unfortunately. I did hear that Avowed was originally meant to be a co-op game, which does potentially explain why the NPCs and cities are so barren, but that's still not a great excuse in my eyes. There's also 4 main zones in Avowed for you to explore: Dawnshore, Emerald Stair, Shatterscarp, and Gallowayne's Tusks, with a hidden 5th zone at the end of the game. In each of these areas, there is one major city that is oftentimes extraordinarily small, and then the surrounding areas are there for you to explore. Now, I will say, bravo Obsidian, I think the exploration is really fun in these overworld areas. There are a lot of cool ways to interact with the environment, like burning away cobwebs to unlock new areas, finding mechanisms that need to be powered to open gates or turn off traps, and you can even cast ice spells to create frozen surfaces on water, which I thought was super fun. There are also a lot of really cool optional pathways that you can follow to find good loot in the overworld and in dungeons too. If you linearly went through and just followed quest markers in Avowed, you would be missing out on a lot of fun exploration. Avowed also tries to make the player get creative with their pathing. Chances are, if you see something cool, you can make your way to it. It's just a matter of how you'll get there. I found a really fun path to a good early game greatsword, for example, that's on screen now, and I'm pretty sure this path was actually unintended, but the game allowed me to get there anyway. I started up a second playthrough after my first to test how I liked melee combat before I made this video, and I went directly to that sword. Having purposefully placed loot really makes exploring more valuable and fun, rather than RNG loot. In Dawnshore also, I saw this weird little crane thing on top of a roof, and when I went up there, I was rewarded with a couple of gems. In the main city of Paradise, I saw a backpack suspended over some water, so I cast a frost spell to reach the items, and I was rewarded with an upgraded spell grimoire, which I proceeded to use for a bunch of the rest of the game. Underwater locations were well flushed out too, which is something that I personally really like. There's one place in particular that I found by utilizing a trinket I received early on that doubled my breath, allowing me to traverse a bunch of water to find a cool hidden room. Areas like that made exploration not only fun, but rewarding. The design of the dungeons and the overworlds was good as well, in my opinion, with the high fantasy setting really shining through in a handful of locations. The Temple of Wall in particular, or Whale, I always forget how to say his name, that temple really stood out to me. There were a couple of areas that required fun platforming sections too, which I always seem to enjoy on a personal level. You're also incentivized to explore the overworld since on every map there were pieces of a godly totem to assemble, there was an ancient memory that would tell you more about the living land's past, there were pieces of strangled Audra for you to cleanse, there were Pargrunan stashes for you to find legendary weaponry at, or armor, and there were treasure maps that you could find as well, which would unlock unique items. This stuff, alongside just finding other items to sell and deconstruct or resources, made it really easy for me to want to discover new locations because I never knew what I was in for or what I was going to find. Again, that's my opinion, we're touching on taste at this point, and I liked what Avowed was cooking in this department, what can I say? But with that said, all the cities in these locations were lackluster, to be generous. Fior Messeverno, Thirdborn, and Solace specifically felt really underwhelming, and Paradis was okay by comparison. All of these cities are legit just a singular space except for Paradis, and there's very little to do in the cities other than just grab quests, buy gear, and then leave. Think about Solitude in Skyrim, how there's those little health potions and arrows you can find on the rooftops. That feels very similar to how the overworld worked in Avowed, but I don't know why this didn't translate well when designing most of the cities. And while traversing the overworlds, while I did enjoy delving into locations and finding new gear and chests and whatnot, there weren't that many characters to find, or non-combat events to engage me with. In fact, I'd say a good portion of the game is splitting your time between exploration and combat, and I've seen mixed reviews on the combat system in the game. I for one liked it, I thought that it flowed really fluidly. I played a gunslinger/mage, which was a really fun combo. It actually seems to me that they took a lot of notes from Pillars in order to make a game that resembled its combat as much as it possibly could. For example, Pillars are real-time with pausing, so they give you an entire pause menu in Avowed for you to choose your actions from. You get 6 main actions that you can have equipped to your hotbar, and then you can have an entire wheel you get to access with all of your throwables, consumables, active item effects, etc. Avowed also integrated interrupts into its gameplay, which is something that can happen to spellcasters in Pillars when they get hit. Think of it like concentration in D&D. Basically, you get stunned out of casting a spell. I thought this was kind of fun because it made me more conscious about where I positioned when I would throw out a blizzard or a fireball. The stats in Pillars of Might, Constitution, Dexterity, Perception, Intellect, and Resolve were also directly ported into Avowed, and they work very similar to how they do in Pillars. Dexterity is really fun to mess around with specifically because it gives a flat speed buff to every action that you do, so if you play the game, I'd recommend dumping a bunch of points into that. Also, upon leveling up, you get a skill point that you can put into one of 3 trees: Fighter, Ranger, or Wizard. These trees have really fun level up effects that can drastically alter your builds as you go along. For example, there's a skill point you can put into Ranger that unlocks an entirely new mechanic of parrying attacks. Warriors have fun taunts they can unlock, and they can charge right into the battlefield, and wizards can buff their wands to make their attacks bounce to multiple enemies, or they can memorize spells, making a grimoire obsolete. I thought it was all quite fun. And many of the things that you can unlock in these stat bars are direct references to skills from the Pillars games. They also have a stance bar like in Elden Ring, so you could create a stance pressure build if you want and get high crit damage on stunned targets, or you could play an AoE caster, or a big meathead, or somewhere in between. They added in a dodge button too, so mechanically there is a bit of complexity to the Avowed combat system. Also, I haven't even mentioned it yet, but the game has 2 loadouts for you to swap from as well, making it have a pretty deep build variety, all things considered, and this loadout system is also directly borrowed from Pillars. But a combat system is only as strong as the enemies that you're fighting, and let me tell you, there's like 15 types of enemies tops. There's spiders, zorips, kith, beetles, ogres, there's like 2 ogres, phantoms, bears, mushrooms, skeletons, and then there's a couple others out there that are kind of getting into spoiler territory, so I won't bring them up. I enjoyed the combat system, like I said, but I do understand the complaints about the game being repetitive, as a lot of the fights in the game just start to feel the same after a while. In this sense though, I will say it felt the most like Skyrim to me, because Skyrim doesn't have a great enemy variety either. But with that said, in defense of Elder Scrolls V, it still has way more things to fight than Avowed, and Skyrim came out 13 years ago. So Avowed should have had greater enemy diversity, especially because Pillars has so many different enemies we didn't ever even see in Avowed. No Wicts, no Oozes, no Trolls, no Vithraks, no Darghouls, and no Dragonfight, let alone Drakes. And that's not even to mention the fact that most of these enemies are just pre-placed in locations and do very little to actively move around, harkening back to the static NPCs in the cities too. And I do have to say, this is how a lot of fights are in Pillars of Eternity as well, with enemies mostly just clumped in one spot so you can plan out your attacks better. But I don't think it necessarily translated well to the first-person perspective. So, did I enjoy the Avowed combat? Personally, yes. But did I wish there were more things to fight? Also yes. Speaking of fighting, did you know that there's companions in the game? There are 4 companions in total: Kai, Marius, Giada, and Yatsley. I do have to say I really liked the conversations they'd all have in camp. It wasn't like in Baldur's Gate 3 where all the companions are spread out all over the place. They were all close enough to talk and chit-chat with one another every time I went back to the camp to do something, so that was actually one of my favorite parts of having them along. That, and they also commented a lot and gave their own points of view frequently during side quests, which I thought was really cool as well, since differing opinions is a really integral part of the Pillars experience. Sadly, these companions are really spread out since they are very, very, very well integrated into the game world of the Living Lands. Most of these characters are pre-established within the spot that they're at. You get Kai almost immediately at Claviger's Landing, but then don't receive Marius until you enter the first city of Paradise, and getting Giada requires you to be a decent way into the second zone of Emerald Stair, while Yatsley doesn't come up until you reach Thirdborn in Zone 3. And this was rough because I started to fucking hate Marius at a certain point. From a gameplay stance, you can only have 2 companions with you at a time though. They each have their own abilities corresponding to their classes, and you can assign these abilities to the hotbar to boss them around during combat. Having only 2 companions meant I had to experiment a bit with party comps, and the one I had the most fun with was Giada and Kai. The really odd thing about the companions that I found just corporate, I guess, was that the companions couldn't be given gear. Like, at all. They had the same base armor / clothing throughout the whole story, and the same weapons, although they seemed to scale with the player level. The reason I say this was corporate is because Avowed's early access bundle unlocks outfits for the characters that you can equip, which is just really cringe. Like, I don't mind not being able to customize what the characters are wearing or holding really, I can take it or leave it, but adding essentially a skin pack on top of that is just scummy. And maybe it had something to do with Microsoft, I don't really know. In the Outer Worlds, you could customize what your companions were at least wearing, so I don't really get where this decision comes from. You also can't talk to the companions outside of camp, weirdly. It's just another odd thing when it comes to this game, you can only talk to them within the camp. With that said though, while they are in camp, they do have different interactions with the different party members that are in there with you while you're talking to them, so maybe that's why. There are also no romance options, which I've heard some people complain about. I don't personally care about it that much. I think Obsidian was trying to build platonic relationships here with most of these characters anyway, but romance options would have been nice. I feel like one strong suit in favor of adding romance is that it allows a game to treat its player base more like adults and less like children. You can tell complex stories through romantic relationships. It's not just about having a sex scene in the game. And that's not to say that you can't tell these same stories with just a platonic relationship. I mean, hell, Pillars 1 doesn't have romance, and those companions are great. It's just that a romantic relationship has more potential to lead to more serious moments sometimes. And just on a personal level, Kai was my favorite companion, followed by Giada, then Yatsley, then Marius, and just dead last. I do not like this guy. Talk about a fucking boring NPC. I don't blame the voice actor at all, because he was given some of the most boring dialogue of all time, but Jesus Christ, man. Even once I finished his quest, I was just annoyed with him. Yatsley didn't really do much for me either. I thought the constant flirty demeanor was odd because she specifically notes that she's in a relationship throughout the story, then continues to make remarks about how hot Kai is and stuff like that. And I always seemed to have some sort of a line that was flirtatious with her, but I never wanted to choose those. I don't know. Maybe it's a me thing. I liked Giada because I just appreciated her general positive vibe, but she wasn't anything too crazy. And then Kai's just the GOAT. He's like the Adair villain in this game, except he's blue this time. But yeah, I guess I don't really have much to say about the companions. They're such an integral part of the Pillar's experience, so limiting them to only 4 was already strange, and then on top of that, only making one, Kai, that people across the board generally like is sad. So this is my Avowed companion tier list. I hope it helps clarify my opinions a bit more clearly. And I'd like to take a minute next to talk about the art style for the game. I thought the load screens and the map design were really well done. Whoever they have on the Obsidian art staff is absolutely killing it, and they have been killing it for the past few years. Also, I don't care if no one else noticed it, but I saw that portrait of Andreas in the Claviger's estate, okay, Obsidian? I see you. But yeah, the art side of the game was really cool to me, but that is fairly objective. I've seen some people complain about the art style to the game and how it differs specifically from the original teaser trailer that we got for Avowed way back in 2018, 2019, maybe even 2020, I can't remember at this point. But the game definitely took on a more lighter tone than what we saw in the original teaser trailer way back when. I like the soundtrack enough too, although it probably won't be remembered as fondly as some of the others in the genre, like Skyrim or The Witcher 3, but it was decent enough. And I already spoke about how I enjoyed the areas, but I also liked a lot of the weapon designs, armor designs, and there were a handful of unique pictures done for the story moments that were hidden across the map as well that I'll show on screen. And before we fully move on from the gameplay, I would like to briefly talk about the upgrade system in Avowed. There are 5 tiers of items: common, rare, epic, superb, and legendary. If you find a unique common weapon, you can upgrade it all the way to legendary as you progress through the game, and the unique weapons also have unique enchantments that come along with them as well. All items can be upgraded using material that you can either find on your map, you can buy from vendors, or you can deconstruct items as well. I ran into a bit of an issue in the endgame due to this system, since my first build was an arquebus on my first bar and a wand and grimoire on the second. All 3 of these items use branches as the level up material. Then, once I got to Galawain's Tusks, I found a really cool pistol, and I respec'd my character, ditching the magic stuff and adding dual-wield pistols, which also took branches as the upgrade material. So needless to say, the upgrade economy was not in my favor by the end of the game. But I did get the Early Access Edition to Avowed, and I beat it on February 23rd, 2025. 4 days later, patch 1.2.4 released, which added, among many other things, more upgrade materials throughout the game to avoid this issue. But yeah, now that we've touched on all the mechanics in the game that I wanted to brush on, let's talk about the story, and why some folks may be disappointed by it. And here's your spoiler warning. I'll be heavily covering the plotline of not only Avowed, but also Pillars 1 and 2, so if that's something you'd rather avoid, then it's been nice knowing you. Thanks for watching this far in. But for those of you who'd like to stay, let me fill you in on Avowed's storyline. So the Adheran Envoy, who is a godlike to an unknown god, is sent to the Living Lands to investigate a soul plague known as the Dream Scourge. The Adheran Empire has had their eye on the Living Lands for a long time now in an attempt to colonize the Untamed Wilds, and this is also meant to unify the people of Adir in a common cause. The zealous and brutal paladin order known as the Steel Garrote are also in the Living Lands. They follow the goddess Wudica and are in the lands somewhat on Adir's behalf, led by Inquisitor Ludwin, a Death Knight who is attempting to bring peace to the Living Lands through very violent means. Immediately upon reaching the Living Lands, you begin hearing a mysterious voice inside your head. This voice is later uncovered to be your unknown god, who reveals themselves to be named Sapadal, the god of the Living Lands. However, Sapadal is imprisoned and has been for a very long time, so much so that this god has literally never been heard of by the general population. And this is something that may have been missed by many people who only played Avowed as their first game. It's very important that you know, in the Pillars universe, the gods are not primordial. They are mortal creations. The main 11 gods of Eora were created by the ancient Anguithan people when they sacrificed their souls to construct them. And these gods are Magran, Aethys, Scan, Galawain, Helia, Remergond, Berith, Wal, Abidan, Andra, and Wudica. Sapadal, however, was created by a different group of ancients, the Akedan, whose Andra veins were cut off from the rest of Eora. So this made Sapadal an outsider when compared to the Anguithan gods. Upon Sapadal's creation, they were unbridled in their emotions, being a quite infantile deity, and by virtue, an unpredictably dangerous one as well. Many times throughout the Living Lands history, Sapadal's actions resulted in the deaths of their Akedan followers. Upon noticing this rogue god, Wudica commissioned an army of magfolk to attack the Living Lands, driving Sapadal to kill their own worshippers while attempting to stave off the attack. While distracted, Wudica and the magfolk imprisoned Sapadal before they could do more harm. So Sapadal begins reaching out to you from their prison now that you're in their domain, and they offer to help you cleanse the Dream Scourge from the Living Lands. However, it is in fact Sapadal that is unwittingly unleashing the Dream Scourge on their people as a defense mechanism against the Steel Garrote and the Adiran invasion. So the game boils down to your decisions and interactions regarding Sapadal's fate and the fate of the Steel Garrote as you move toward their prison. Since Sapadal is basically a child, the ways in which you interact with it are paramount to the type of ending you'll get. You can teach Sapadal to be kind and ensure that they have learned from their mistakes, asking them to temper their emotions and treat the world with more care. Or you can ignite fury in Sapadal and unleash them to wreak havoc across the Living Lands once more. You can even straight up kill Sapadal, making sure that this god never harms a single person again. And then there's the colonial stuff. You have to decide the fate for the Adirans coming to the Living Lands. You can make it so the Living Lands becomes an official colony of Adir, stays independent, or essentially becomes a vassal state of the Empire. All the while throughout the story, you're trying to protect Adir's reputation from being sullied by Inquisitor Ludwin, who is extremely brutal and is painted as the game's villain basically from the get-go, although you can side with her. And in between this major overarching plot, there are smaller quests in the 4 zones, all of which lead to major decisions at the end of the areas. The end of Shatterscarp in particular was probably my favorite decision that was made throughout the game. So roughly, the themes of Avowed are nature versus nurture, colonialism versus independence, tradition versus change, and loyalty versus morality, all of which are good themes, and there's likely some that I missed packed in there somewhere too. So I found the most interesting part of the game to be revolving around Sapadal, since the idea of basically teaching morality to a literal god is very interesting to me. If I had to give an overall blanket statement for Avowed's story though, I would say that it's niche. This story is not for everyone, especially since it kind of relies on already having a general understanding of Pillars lore, and of the importance of a new god existing in the first place. I also appreciate that you can turn against Adir's interests in the Living Lands, although it's oddly implied that that's what you should do from the get-go, as the implication is that imperialism is bad and freedom is good.
The implication.
Which, yeah, generally I agree, but I think with your position being as an envoy from Adir, it should maybe take a bit more convincing to get you to take this position. And this is a total side note, but when you first encounter Sapadal, they look like this. And then when they're fully revealed to you, they look like this.
You are here. You heard us in the roots. You seek the garden.
And honestly, I would have just preferred the white void at that point. Pillars 1, for instance, had this cool Adra art whenever you spoke to a god instead of showing them. And Pillars 2 had pre-established art for every god as well, and this cool background for speaking to them that reflected the beyond. And they could have done that, because they have cool art for Sapadal in the game already, which I've shown on screen. But for some reason, we got this, which suffers from the same static issues that the NPCs have in the cities. Shoutout never moves around, it just idles there forever, and it doesn't even move its mouth when it speaks. And don't get me wrong, I overall like the design of this thing, especially the eyeballs on the right side of its face. I think those are sick, but something is just off with it overall. And I think it's the eyes. It's the Delimgon situation again. I don't know why they gave Shoutout pupils. This may have been done to humanize it a bit, but for me, it just makes them look kind of freaky. I even went over it with a basic brush in MS Paint, and I think it just looks a lot better with the white eyes. All the gods and pillars previously had blank void eyes like this, and I wish they'd done the same for Shoutout, although it does go to show that they're independent from the Ingwithan gods at the very least, I suppose, but I don't think it was a good choice. Moving on from Shoutout, there were a lot of fun mentions about events from previous games and some legacy characters that were brought along, like Sansa from Deadfire. You get a chance to meet Ringrim, who's one of the mages in the Council of the Archmagi. She did have this weird thing on her forehead though, and it didn't move correctly with her face, but that just gets back to the kind of jank NPC thing. There's these fun notes from Tane also, the author of Tane's Chaotic Orb, by the way, spread throughout every level, and they're just fun to read. I enjoyed moments like that. Overall though, I was disappointed that we never really got closure on the events of the end of Pillars 2, since Aethys destroying the wheel is a really big deal, and no one seemed to really know what happened there, which is a way to make the player's choices in Deadfire matter more, I suppose, but it also does invalidate a couple of endings in Pillars 2 as well. Namely, there's a choice where Aethys ends the world of Eora entirely, so obviously that ending is not canon anymore. And my point is that sometimes it's futile to keep things ambiguous like this. In my eyes, you could either do what Pillars 2 did and allow for a history of Eora to be written at the beginning of an Avowed playthrough, or you just canonize one of the endings properly, but again, that's just my opinion. I don't know how much more I can go on about this game though. I've been doing a lot of thinking about Avowed, obviously, and in my opinion, it would have worked better as some sort of literature. Be it a comic, a graphic novel, or even a full-on book, I think that's where this storyline belongs. It should have been about the Envoy sent on a quest to the Living Lands, Lord of the Rings style, and along the way the Envoy meets the members of the party. I think it would have worked better since they would have been a pre-written character rather than a flexible one who has to be played by a player. But with that in mind too, you lose out on the player choice that's so important to the Pillars universe and so important to what Avowed's overall message is. So I don't quite know what the correct fix here would be, but I do like the idea of getting books in the Pillars universe in the future. Before I finish this video out, I have to bring up the woke allegations too. I saw nothing in Avowed that I thought was even remotely woke. I feel stupid even saying it. The most woke thing in the game, air quotes, was that there was a lesbian couple somewhere in one of the cities, and I think Kai is implied to be bisexual at one point. I've seen people complain about pronouns in the game too. I just don't understand that. There's a setting when you start the game to have pronouns enabled or disabled. You can just turn that on or off according to your preference and not let it bother you. To quote Donkey,
I don't get how the game is woke. I almost fell asleep in the intro.
But yeah, I don't really get where the woke stuff comes from. If you're truly mad about a game having gay couples and pronouns in a fantasy world, then you're just a fucking idiot. I don't know what else to tell you. Some people just need something to hate though, I guess. And I also haven't really felt like I can contribute to this conversation because I didn't have any problems with this personally, but some people did say that their performance with Avowed was really, really bad. Again, I didn't experience this, but if you did have poor performance with Avowed, please let me know down in the comments below. Definitely if you're about to buy this game, check out what the specs of your device are that you're going to be playing it on, because it would be really bad if you spent $70 on something that you can't even play. At the end of the day though, Avowed is just sort of average. To me, Avowed resembled Skyrim in the sense that it's more fun as an action RPG than it is as a traditional role-playing game. The role that you are playing in Avowed is preset, sort of like how you're predetermined to be the Dragonborn of Prophecy. You're predetermined to be the Adiran Envoy every single time in Avowed. And that makes the focus more heavy on the combat, which personally, again, I found to be fun. So Avowed, strangely, is more of an action RPG for me than a traditional RPG. Although I will say, the decisions in this game are better than Skyrim. I've never heard anyone say anything different in that respect, and if you have heard someone say that, that is just it's just incorrect. It's got some cool ideas floating around, decent combat and exploration, and a good team of artists, in my opinion, sadly overshadowed by a mostly unreactive and overall empty experience with the NPCs. Again, I don't think the devs set out to make an underwhelming game, it's just sort of how things happened. However, I will say, I'll definitely play Avowed again. Like I said, most of the enjoyment comes from just having another game in Aora for me, but I will be hanging out over here waiting for Pillars 3 to drop in the meantime. I know Obsidian has gotten a lot of shit recently for being like a dead company and people just want New Vegas 2, but personally, I've never played a bad Obsidian game. I think at most you could say some of their games recently have been mid, but they haven't done anything to slight me, at least not nearly anything as bad as what Bethesda Game Studios has done recently, so I'll continue to at least stand up for this game for the meantime. I do want to mention just really quickly while we're on the topic though, set your expectations low for Elder Scrolls 6, okay? People out there have this perfect plotline envisioned and a perfect setting in mind and a perfect gameplay system with perfect graphics, and they think it's going to come out and it'll be just like 2011 again, and Elder Scrolls 6 is going to fix their marriage. But in reality, where I usually live, I think Elder Scrolls 6 will let you down if you think like this. Imagine the worst gameplay possible. Imagine terrible graphics, imagine buggy NPCs. Expect Bethesda to release that, and when you play Elder Scrolls 6, you'll likely find yourself enjoying it much more. Not to say that those problems won't be problematic, but it'll at least soften the blow a little bit for you when the game finally comes out and it's the way it is. Honestly, I had moderately low expectations for Avowed, but I had a feeling that I'd like it anyway. And honestly, I'm just happy to have received another game in the world that I love. I think Elder Scrolls 6 will likely feel the same for me. I've long said, I will probably enjoy Elder Scrolls 6, but objectively, I know it won't be good. I've been Darloth, and I'll talk to you in the next one. Before the video ends, I'd like to give a massive shout out to my channel members, all of whom I greatly appreciate for deciding to send me a small portion of their income to support the work done on this channel. If you'd like to become a member yourself, please check out the link in the description below. Special thanks to Haas, Content Pill, Braden Thompson, Jarl Ulfric Stormcloak, Zickard, Skooma Addict, Rushfan217, Luke, Gary Combine, Ilya J, Friendly Trevor 95, To The Max, Alex McLaren, One Time I Punched a Dolphin, Sterling Butte Curcio, Brave Fen, Arthur Copani da Silva, HS Crimson, Drake Butler, Chad Clayton, Calorine Darkness, Celise, Silver Balls, Cintola, Ina the Khajiit, Peace, Sophie, British Rogue, The Thin White Duke, Sequencer, Sir Ragu III, Brendel Almeida Santos, Marcus Strangle, Omo, Jacob Waymo 22, Abby Normal, Faust Lament, The Chosen J, Alexis Price, Ranger McKay, Breezy Stratton, Jake AS, Soulless Saint, TJ, Ophelia Drowning, Najee aka Tracy, Jug, Beewolf, Aaron Dobbs, Dishonored Pro 3500, OOP, Joel Evers DeBash, and Inherent Man X. Thank you guys so much, and I will see you all in the next one. Peace out.